The cell was cold, the air laced with the sharp tang of iron and mildew. A single bulb hung from the ceiling, casting a pallid, sickly light over the rough-hewn walls. It was never fully dark in here, not in the way Luke remembered darkness from the days before. The bulb buzzed faintly, a reminder that even small mercies like silence were luxuries long gone. Luke sat cross-legged on his cot, his back pressed against the damp stone wall. He stared at the faded tattoo on his wrist, 1461. The numbers didn't feel like his. They felt like chains etched into his skin. He traced them with a finger as if trying to scrape them away. He used to be someone, once, a boy who dreamed of playing soccer, of going to university, of someday building a life worth living. But those memories were distant now, like pictures crumpled and shoved into the back of a drawer. A soft sound pulled his attention, Jake shifting on his cot across the room. His best friend had always been restless, even in the days before, but here the movement felt almost defiant, a refusal to sit still while the world crushed them. "You ever think about it?" Jake asked, his voice barely audible. Luke glanced over. "Think about what?" "Who we were, who we are. Doesn't it mess with your head?" Jake's green eyes caught the dim light, his expression raw, unguarded. Luke hesitated, his fingers tightening on his wrist. All the time. The admission surprised him, as if the words had been dragged out against his will. Jake gave him a knowing look, the faintest shadow of a grin. "I knew it," Jake said. "You've got that face." Luke frowned. "What face?" "The one that screams, 'I'm planning something.'" "I'm not planning anything," Luke lied, turning away. He studied the cell instead. 6 men shared the space, each one marked by their assigned numbers, and the same hollow-eyed expression of the broken. The walls were bare stone, cold and rough under their hands. The single bulb above flickered now and then, like it might any second, though it never did. The heavy clang of the door interrupted them, the sound ricocheting off the walls. A ripple of tension spread through the room as a vampire guard stepped inside. Tall, skeletal, his pale skin gleaming under the sickly light, he moved with an inhuman grace that made Luke's stomach turn. "Line up," the guard commanded, his voice sharp and clipped. The men scrambled into position, their chains clinking softly. Luke stood beside Jake, heart pounding as the vampire's crimson gaze swept over them. He knew better than to meet those eyes directly. Even now, it felt like a death sentence waiting to happen. 1461. 1482, the guard said, pointing at Luke and Jake. "East wing, move!" Luke swallowed hard as he stepped forward. The east wing was a labyrinth, its walls decorated with grotesque paintings and tapestries that seemed to writhe under the torchlight. He'd been there before, hauling supplies or scrubbing floors until his hands bled. This time, as the guard led them through the winding halls, Luke tried to absorb every detail. The tapestries, the locked doors, the patterns on the floor. His mind mapped each twist and turn, clinging to the hope that someday this knowledge might save them. As they passed one of the side rooms, Luke caught a glimpse of the grotesque power dynamics that ruled the mansion. A vampire sat in a high-backed crimson chair, his pale fingers combing lazily through the hair of a young woman kneeling at his feet. She was wearing an intricate black dress, more decoration than clothing, her head bowed, her hands folded neatly on her lap. Luke forced himself to look away, but Jake didn't. "She doesn't even flinch," Jake muttered under his breath, his voice low but filled with something Luke couldn't quite name, anger, maybe pity. "Keep moving!" the guard snapped, his voice like a whip, but Jake didn't move right away. His steps slowed, his eyes lingering on the woman. Luke nudged him sharply, and Jake blinked, shaking himself out of whatever trance had gripped him. They hurried to catch up to the guard, who gave them a warning glance but said nothing more. "She looked dead inside," Jake said after a moment, his voice hollow. "They all do," Luke replied. His tone was flat, mechanical. He didn't dare let the words carry weight. Not here. But Jake fell silent, his jaw clenched, his fists tightening at his sides. They turned another corner, and the corridor opened into a vast hall lit by flickering torches. The east wing loomed ahead, its doors carved with images of fanged beasts devouring prey. For all its grandeur, it was a mausoleum, a monument to the living dead. Jake leaned close to Luke, his voice a whisper, barely audible. "One day, we'll get out of here." Luke didn't reply. He didn't want to crush Jake's fragile hope, but he couldn't feed it either. Not yet. The West Wing was a world apart from the cold, damp cells where they slept. The hall stretched endlessly, filled with long, gleaming tables set beneath chandeliers dripping with crystals. Golden sconces cast warm light onto polished marble floors, and the air smelled of roasted meat, spiced wine, and something metallic Luke couldn't name but knew all too well. This was where the vampires dined. Luke and Jake stood at the edge of the room with the other slaves, heads bowed, waiting for the first command. 100 eyes swirled with predatory hunger. Luke kept his own gaze fixed on the floor, every muscle coiled tight as the vampires entered, their silken clothes brushing against the stone like whispers of death. Jake leaned in close, his voice barely a breath. "They eat like kings." Luke nudged him sharply with his elbow, not daring to respond. The vampires moved languidly, their steps graceful, predatory. They took their seats at the tables while the human slaves scurried forward, carrying ornate platters of food. Roast meats glistened under the chandeliers, surrounded by vegetables arranged like art. The vampires did eat human food, but it wasn't why they were here. At the far end of the room, a group of pets entered. They were adorned in silks and chains, their skin pale and marked by faint scars or fresh bites. Each one belonged to a vampire, their lives bound in submission and servitude. Luke couldn't help but glance at Jake, whose jaw tightened as his eyes lingered on a young woman with long auburn hair. She looked no older than 20, her wrists bound by delicate golden cuffs as she walked behind her master. "She shouldn't be here," Jake muttered, his voice dark. "She doesn't have a choice," Luke replied coldly. "Neither do we." The feast began. Luke's duties that evening were simple: keep the tables clear, refill goblets, and avoid attracting attention. The vampires drank deep from their chalices, their laughter echoing like the sound of cracking glass. It wasn't long before the real feast began. The first vampire, a gaunt man with silver-streaked hair, grabbed his pet by the wrist and pulled her into his lap. The room grew quieter, the air thick with anticipation. His lips brushed the girl's neck, and then his fangs sank deep into her flesh. Her muffled gasp was lost beneath the sound of goblets clinking and forks scraping plates. One by one the vampires followed suit. Pets were pulled from their places, their bodies trembling as their masters fed. Some tried to hide their fear, others embraced their role with eerie obedience. The sight turned Luke's stomach, but he didn't let it show. Jake, however, was different. He wasn't just disgusted, he was enraged. "She's just a girl," Jake hissed under his breath, his fists clenched at his sides. "Keep your mouth shut," Luke whispered sharply, grabbing Jake's arm. Jake shook him off, his green eyes blazing. It was a mistake. The female vampire nearest them turned her head, her crimson gaze locking onto Jake. She was strikingly beautiful, with pale, flawless skin and hair as black as a raven's wing. Her lips curled into a predatory smile, revealing fangs slick with blood. "Speak up, little slave," she purred. "You seem upset." Jake stiffened, his jaw set, but he didn't answer. The vampire rose from her seat, her movements languid but dangerous. She towered over Jake, her presence suffocating. "When I ask a question, you answer." Luke's breath caught in his throat as the vampire's hand shot out, striking Jake hard across the face. He staggered but didn't fall, blood trickling from the corner of his mouth. "You dared to defy me?" she said, her voice like silk over a blade. Luke clenched his fists, rage boiling inside him, but he forced himself to stay still. Acting out would only make things worse, for both of them. The vampire grabbed Jake by the collar, dragging him toward the exit. "I'll teach you what happens when slaves forget their place." Jake didn't struggle. He cast a single glance at Luke before disappearing through the doorway. The rest of the meal passed in a blur. Luke moved mechanically, clearing plates, refilling goblets, and avoiding the eyes of the vampires. but inside his mind churned with rage. The image of Jake being dragged away burned in his memory. He wanted to rip that vampire apart, to tear her fangs from her mouth and make her bleed the way she made Jake bleed. But he couldn't. Not yet. When the meal finally ended, Luke's duties shifted to escorting the pets back to their quarters. The vampires retreated to their private chambers, sated for the moment, leaving the room heavy with the scent of blood and fear. Luke led the pets down a dim corridor, their chains clinking softly. Some walked with their heads high, their expressions blank, while others stumbled, their legs weak from blood loss. He couldn't help but glance at the auburn-haired girl Jake had noticed earlier. She was quieter than the others, her eyes downcast but alert. "You'll be fine," Luke murmured to her, his voice low enough that the guards wouldn't hear. She didn't respond, but her fingers tightened briefly on the chain she held. It was a small gesture, but it gave Luke a flicker of hope. Luke led the line of pets down the dim corridor toward their quarters, the iron shackles on their wrists jingling softly with each step. The air was heavy, thick with the metallic scent of blood and the quiet murmurs of the pets, who moved like ghosts in the flickering torchlight. Their quarters were small but opulent compared to the slaves' cells. Velvet-lined beds, ornate mirrors, and faintly glowing chandeliers spoke to the vampires' desire to keep their prized possessions presentable. But the luxury was a farce. Every corner of the room reeked of control. The slaves lined up along the far wall as one of the guards barked orders. "Tend to them. Make it quick." No unnecessary contact. Iron tablets were distributed first, handed out in small tin cups of water. Luke moved methodically, offering the bitter tablets to the pets, who gulped them down without a word. Their hands trembled as they drank, some leaving faint smudges of blood on the rims. He didn't speak to them. The guard's eyes were everywhere, sharp and unyielding. "Strip them," the guard growled. Luke hesitated, but the others didn't. With practiced efficiency, they began removing the pets' delicate clothing, revealing pale, bruised skin marred by fresh bite marks. Some pets stood numbly, their eyes glazed, while others flinched at every movement. He worked quickly, untying the silken ribbons of one pet's dress and letting it fall to the floor. Her body was as thin as paper, her ribs stark against her skin. Luke's jaw tightened, but he didn't linger. Guards stood at every corner of the room, their eyes like razors, watching for any movement that might hint at improper touch or empathy. One guard smirked, his hand resting on the hilt of his whip as if daring one of them to make a mistake. Buckets of warm water were brought in next, along with rough cloths. Luke soaked one in the water, wringing it out before beginning to clean the pets. He avoided their eyes, focusing on the task at hand. He didn't speak, didn't linger, just wiped away the blood and grime as gently as he could without drawing attention. The auburn-haired girl from earlier flinched when he touched her shoulder, her eyes flicking up to his for the briefest second. He gave the slightest shake of his head, a silent reassurance that he meant no harm. She said nothing, her lips pressed into a thin line, but her shoulders relaxed slightly. When the task was done, the pets were led to their beds. Some collapsed immediately, curling into fetal positions as if trying to hide from the world. Others sat stiffly, their eyes unfocused, waiting for the next command. Luke and the other slaves were dismissed shortly after, escorted back to their own quarters under the ever-watchful eyes of the guards. Luke had barely sat down on his cot when the cell door opened again, and Jake was shoved inside. He stumbled forward, collapsing to his knees with a strangled groan. His shirt was in tatters, barely clinging to his bloodied back. Crimson streaks ran down his arms and legs, his face swollen and bruised almost beyond recognition. "Sit him up," the guard barked at Luke. Luke hurried to Jake's side, lifting him under the arms and dragging him to his cot. Jake hissed in pain, his teeth gritted but didn't fight. From the doorway, a second guard carried a bucket of salt water and threw it over Jake without warning. Psh! Jake screamed, the sound raw and animalistic as the salt seeped into the open wounds across his back. His body convulsed, his hands clawing at the cot as if trying to dig into the stone beneath. Luke's hands clenched into fists, the urge to lash out boiling in his veins, but he forced himself to stay still. He couldn't do anything, not now, not yet. The guard sneered. "Be grateful. Keeps the infection away. If you're lucky, you'll live to see tomorrow." The door slammed shut behind them, leaving the room in silence save for Jake's ragged breathing. Luke knelt beside him, grabbing the thin blanket from his cot and draping it carefully over Jake's trembling frame. "Jake," he said quietly. Jake didn't respond, his face buried in the crook of his arm. "We'll get out of here," Luke whispered, his voice trembling with suppressed rage. "I swear to you, we'll get out. And they'll pay for this." Jake let out a weak, bitter laugh, his breath hitching as he fought back tears. Luke sat back on his cot, staring at the tattoo on his wrist, 1461. It felt heavier than ever, like it was pressing into his very soul. The light bulb above flickered faintly, casting long, wavering shadows across the cell. Shadows that felt alive, twisting and stretching, whispering promises of vengeance in the quiet darkness. Luke stared at the damp stone ceiling of their cell, the muffled sounds of the mansion's nightly activities filtering through the walls. Jake lay on his cot across the room, his back wrapped in bandages that were already stained dark red. His breathing was shallow, each exhale carrying a faint hiss of pain. "You should rest," Luke muttered, breaking the heavy silence. Jake chuckled bitterly, the sound rasping in his throat. "What's the point? Can't rest when every breath feels like fire?" Luke sighed and sat up, his hands clasped loosely between his knees. He'd seen slaves beaten before, but seeing Jake dragged back, barely conscious and whipped like an animal, had lit a fire in him that he couldn't extinguish. "She'd do it again, you know," Luke said quietly, his voice barely audible over the drip of water from the corner. Jake turned his head, his green eyes flashing in the dim light. "Not if we're gone." Luke froze, the words hanging in the air like a blade poised to fall. "Gone?" Jake propped himself up on one elbow, wincing as the movement pulled at his wounds. "Yeah, gone. Out of this damned mansion. Out of their reach. You can't tell me you haven't thought about it." Luke stared at him, his jaw tightening. Thinking about it and doing it are two different things. You know what happens to escapees? They don't just kill you, they make an example out of you, out of everyone. And what's the alternative? Jake shot back, his voice rising despite the strain. "Stay here? Let them beat us, bleed us dry, or worse?" Luke looked away, his hands clenching into fists. He had thought about it, dreamed of it even, but every time the harsh reality crushed the fleeting hope. "There's no way out," Luke said finally, his voice flat. "This place is a fortress. The guards, the gates. Even if we made it out, they'd hunt us down." Jake swung his legs over the edge of his cot, his movements slow and pained. "There's always a way out. You just have to find it." Luke's eyes flicked to Jake's face, noting the determined set of his jaw, despite the bruises and cuts. "You sound like you already have a plan." "Not yet," Jake admitted, "but I'm working on it. I've been watching the guards, the routines. There are gaps, small ones, but they're there." Luke shook his head. "It's suicide." "Maybe," Jake said, leaning forward, his voice low and urgent. "But if we stay, we're dead anyway. At least out there we have a chance. Don't you want more than this? Don't you want to fight back?" Luke didn't answer. The fire in his chest burned brighter, but it was tempered by a crushing weight of fear and doubt. Jake sighed and leaned back against the wall, his expression softening. "I'm not saying we do it tomorrow. But think about it, Luke. We can't just survive. We have to live." Luke stared at the floor, the flickering torchlight casting long shadows across the room. Jake's words echoed in his mind, planting a seed that would take root whether he wanted it to or not. "I'll think about it," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Jake nodded, a faint smile tugging at his split lip. "That's all I ask." The silence crept back in, thicker than before. The drip of water in the corner became impossible to ignore, slow, deliberate, like it was counting something out. Luke leaned back against the cold stone wall, closing his eyes, but the sounds of the mansion didn't fade. They shifted. Footsteps above, a door opening, then something else, faint, distant, not quite a cry, not quite a breath. He frowned, listening. The sound lingered, threading through the dark, softening into something quieter, closer, breathing. She had been holding her breath for too long. The room was eerily quiet, the air thick and unmoving, yet beneath it something lingered. A rhythm, slow, steady, dripping. Her body ached as she swung her legs over the side of the bed, the stiffness settling deep into her bones. She ignored it, she had grown used to pain. The room around her was eerily quiet, the air heavy with the faint metallic tang of blood that seemed to linger everywhere in the mansion. Standing slowly, she crossed to the cracked mirror above the wash basin. She hesitated before looking at her reflection, dreading what she might see. When she finally raised her eyes, she barely recognized herself. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, with faint veins tracing delicate patterns beneath the surface. Bruises dotted her collarbone and shoulders, shadows left by Lord Varian's cruel hands, and the bite marks on her neck were raw, still oozing slightly. Her fingers brushed the marks absently, and she winced at the tenderness. The wounds would heal quickly. They always did, but they left scars that told a story she wished she could forget. Her gaze traveled downward, taking in her slender frame. Despite her injuries, there was still an undeniable beauty to her, stark and haunting. Her brunette hair fell in loose waves over her shoulders, framing her face with its sharp cheekbones and full lips. Her emerald green eyes, though dulled by exhaustion, still shone wit. A faint fire, a reminder of the spirit she refused to let die. She pulled at the thin fabric of her nightgown, revealing the soft curve of her breasts and the bruises that marred her ribcage. Her chest rose and fell with each shallow breath, the tension in her body a constant weight. Her legs bore the same marks of her captivity, scratches, faint scars, and bruises from years of being used and discarded. Yet even in her battered state, there was a graceful strength in the way she moved, a quiet resilience that refused to bow entirely to the vampires who claimed ownership of her. She straightened her posture, brushing her hair back from her face. She was still here. She was still alive. And as long as she could stand, there was still a chance for something more. The door creaked open, breaking her reverie. 2 slaves entered, their heads bowed and eyes averted. She recognized them, number 0847 and number 1461. The taller one, 1461, carried a small tray with an iron tablet and a glass of water. "Your supplements, Miss," he said quietly, his voice low and devoid of emotion. She took the tablet, her fingers brushing against his briefly as she accepted the glass of water. She swallowed the pill, the metallic taste spreading across her tongue as she drank. "Thank you," she murmured, though she knew they weren't supposed to speak. 1461's gaze flicked to her face for the barest moment, his dark eyes meeting hers. There was something in his expression, an unspoken defiance, a flicker of humanity that had not been extinguished by this place. "Come on!" the other slave hissed, pulling at his arm. 1461 lowered his head and followed his companion out of the room, the door shutting heavily behind them. She turned back to the mirror, her fingers brushing against the bite marks on her neck once more. The fire in her green eyes sparked again, stronger this time. For all their power, the vampires couldn't take everything from her. Not yet. The grand dining hall was an opulent chamber of decadence and death. Crystal chandeliers cast flickering light over the long table, where vampires reclined on intricately carved chairs, their movements languid and predatory. The pets knelt at their master's feet, dressed in thin silks that did little to shield them from the chill of the room or the leering gazes of the vampires. She sat at Lord Varian's feet, her heart pounding as she stared at the polished marble floor. Her stomach churned at the sounds around her, the laughter, the murmured taunts, the occasional muffled sobs of pets who had displeased their masters. She didn't dare look up, but she didn't have to. She could hear everything. To her left, she caught a faint whimper. A younger girl, no more than 18, knelt trembling beside her vampire. The man's long fingers trailed up the girl's arm, his nails scraping over her skin like a predator toying with its prey. When the girl flinched, he chuckled darkly and leaned down, whispering something in her ear that made her eyes widen in fear. Moments later, he yanked her up by the hair and dragged her from the room, his fangs bared in a grin that promised nothing good. The pet turned her gaze back to the floor, bile rising in her throat. She'd seen it too many times, the way some pets simply disappeared after these feasts. They weren't killed outright. The vampires preferred to savor their suffering first. Some were drained, others broken, their bodies discarded like ruined toys when they no longer served a purpose. To her right, another vampire had his pet, a pale wayfish boy, pressed against his leg, stroking the boy's hair absent-mindedly as though petting an animal. She recognized the vampire, Lady Aveline, the same one who had punished Jake earlier. Lady Aveline's crimson lips curled into a smirk as she leaned down to whisper something in the boy's ear. He froze, his hands trembling as he clutched at the fabric of her gown. "She's crueler than most, Lord Varian's V," Ois murmured from above, startling her. She stiffened as his hand slid into her hair, tilting her head back to meet his gaze. "Aveline doesn't like to keep her pets long. A shame, really. They burn out so quickly under her particular attentions." Her gaze flicked to Lady Aveline, whose sharp green eyes glittered with malice as she traced a fingernail along the boy's jawline. "You're lucky," Varian continued, his voice a silken whisper. "You've lasted longer than most." Before she could respond, his hand tightened in her hair, pulling her head back sharply. A gasp escaped her lips as he leaned down, his cold breath brushing against her neck. "You're distracted tonight," he murmured, his tone soft but edged with warning. "I'm sorry, my lord," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Not good enough," he replied. His lips brushed her skin, and then she felt the sharp sting of his fangs piercing her neck. The pain was searing at first, radiating down her spine and into her limbs. But as the seconds stretched, the sensation shifted. Warmth flooded her veins, mingling with the ache, leaving her breathless and dazed. She hated how her body betrayed her, how the vampire's bite induced a heady, euphoric haze, even as it drained her life. Her vision blurred, and when she dared to glance up, she saw his eyes. They glowed a deep crimson, like embers in a dying fire, burning with an intensity that made her stomach twist. "You taste of defiance," Varian murmured, his voice a low rumble that sent shivers down her spine. "It's intoxicating." Her fingers curled into fists, her nails biting into her palms as she fought to remain still. She couldn't show weakness. Not here. Not now. When he finally pulled back, she sagged against his leg, her breath shallow and uneven. He licked his lips, his eyes still glowing as he regarded her with something between amusement and hunger. "Good girl," he said softly, stroking her hair as though she were a favored pet. "Now behave, or next time I won't be so gentle." The evening dragged on, the air thick with the scent of wine and blood. The vampires grew bolder as the night deepened, their hands wandering over their pets, their whispers turning to cruel laughter. One pet-a-boy, barely older than she was lifted onto the table, his master pinning him down as the other vampires laughed and jeered. Her stomach churned, and she looked away, her nails digging into her palms. Her own body trembled as Lord Varian's hand remained on her shoulder, his grip firm but not painful. Yet she knew his kindness was a facade, one he could strip away at a moment's notice. Through it all, her gaze kept drifting to the slaves who moved around the room, clearing plates and refilling glasses. One of them, 1461, stood out, his movements precise but tense. She recognized the quiet anger in his eyes, the barely concealed fire that matched her own. When their eyes met briefly, a spark passed between them. It was fleeting, but it was enough to remind her that she wasn't alone in this nightmare. As the feast finally came to an end, Lord Varian stood, pulling her to her feet. Her legs wobbled, but she steadied herself, casting one last glance at 1461 before she was led away. His eyes followed her for only a second, no longer than that, but it was enough. Something passed between them, not words, not even understanding. Just a quiet, stubborn refusal to be hollowed out completely. As she was pulled through the towering doors and back into the winding corridors, the sounds of the hall faded behind her laughter, footsteps, the scrape of chairs, until only the mansion remained. It breathed around her, slow, heavy, watching. The mansion was alive with its own dark pulse. Luke felt it now more than ever as he moved through its holes, like something vast breathing just beneath the stone. Every corridor, every doorway seemed to hold its gaze on him, waiting, its secrets pressing in from all sides. Today, he would glimpse more of its depths than he ever had before. Assigned to solo cleaning duties after the morning bloodletting, Luke welcomed the opportunity to wander further than the west wing and dining hall. He hoped the monotony of scrubbing and dusting would drown the restless anger still bubbling inside him from the sight of Jake's battered body the night before. The first rooms were typical of the high-ranking vampires, lavishly furnished with dark woods, velvet drapes, and ornate chandeliers. Each chamber bore the personality of its occupant. In one room, Luke found an unsettling collection of bones displayed in a glass cabinet, human by the looks of it. The vampire who resided there was known for her artistic tendencies, using the remains of those who displeased her to create macabre sculptures. In another, a male vampire's walls were lined with mirrors, not for vanity, but for punishment. Luke shuddered as he recalled hearing slaves talk about how the mirrors were enchanted to trap the reflections of those who angered him, forcing them to watch themselves waste away until death. Every room seemed to carry its own horrors, and Luke's anger simmered beneath the surface as he scrubbed floors and polished furniture. In one of the chambers, Luke encountered another vampire, lounging in a high-backed chair while sipping from a crystal goblet. The metallic scent in the air made it clear what he was drinking. A low whimper drew Luke's attention to the corner of the room. There, in a cage far too small for a human, was a young woman, her naked body marred by whip marks. Her arms were folded tightly around herself as though trying to hold together the last shreds of her dignity. "Beautiful, isn't she?" the vampire said lazily, noticing Luke's glance. Luke tightened his grip on the cleaning cloth in his hand. "Yes, my lord," he said through clenched teeth. The vampire chuckled. "Don't look so grim, slave. She's just a pet. They're made to endure." He drained the last of his goblet and waved Luke away. "Go on, then, unless you'd like to join her in the cage." Luke left quickly. The image of the caged woman burned into his mind. His fists trembled as he carried his cleaning supplies to the next room, but he knew there was nothing he could do, not yet. As the day wore on, Luke was assigned to clean near the mansion's forbidden east wing, a place spoken of only in hushed whispers among the slaves. It was said to house the chambers of the arch-vampire, the one who ruled over the mansion, and likely the entire region with absolute authority. The arch-vampire rarely left his chambers, but his presence was felt everywhere. Even the high-ranking vampires lowered their voices and tread carefully when speaking of him. Luke's heart raced as he approached the heavily guarded hallway leading to the arch-vampire's chambers. Two towering vampires in dark armor stood at the entrance, their expressions as cold and unyielding as the stone walls around them. "No closer," one of them barked as Luke moved within 10 paces of the doors. Luke nodded quickly, setting his bucket down and pretending to focus on scrubbing the floor. He risked a glance at the doors, massive and made of black iron, intricately carved with symbols that seemed to shift and writhe when he looked at them too long. Rumors swirled among the slaves about what lay beyond those doors. Some said the arch-vampire kept an army of feral vampires chained in the depths, ready to unleash upon any who dared defy him. Others whispered that he could read the minds of everyone in the mansion, that he already knew every secret and plot before they even formed. As Luke cleaned, he caught snippets of conversation from the guards. "He's been restless lately," one muttered. "Can you blame him? The rebellion in the north grows stronger every day. It won't be long before they're at our gates." The other scoffed. "Let them come. He'll crush them like he always does." Luke's R's pricked at the mention of a rebellion, but he kept his gaze fixed on the floor, scrubbing harder to mask his eavesdropping. Later that evening, Luke was sent to deliver a fresh vial of his blood to Lord Malric, one of the mansion's most enigmatic high-ranking vampires. Malric's chambers were stark compared to the others, a simple desk, a few bookshelves, and an armchair by the window. The vampire himself sat behind the desk, his piercing gray eyes studying Luke as he entered. 1461, Malric said, his voice smooth but tinged with an edge of amusement. "Come in." Luke placed the silver tray on the desk and stepped back, lowering his gaze. "Interesting," Malric said, leaning back in his chair. "You don't bow like the others. I mean no disrespect, my lord," Luke replied carefully. Malric smirked. "Of course you don't, but it's refreshing. Most slaves are so broken." He rose from his chair, circling Luke slowly. "There's something in your eyes. Defiance, perhaps. It's rare to see that here." Luke kept his expression neutral, but his heart raced. Malric stopped in front of him, his gaze sharp and calculating. "Tell me, slave, do you plan to escape this place?" Luke's breath caught, but he forced himself to remain calm. "No, my lord. I serve the mansion." Malric chuckled, a low and knowing sound. "You're a terrible liar, but don't worry, I find it entertaining. After all, it's been far too long since anyone had the courage to try." He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "If you ever do decide to make a move, perhaps I could be of assistance. I'm not fond of the way the others treat humans, you see. It's distasteful." Luke met Malric's gaze briefly, searching for any sign of deception. The vampire's expression was unreadable. "Go now," Malric said, stepping back, "for someone less understanding decides to question you." Luke nodded, his mind racing as he left the room. He didn't trust Malric, but the vampire's words planted a seed of possibility, a dangerous but undeniable hope. It sat uneasily in his chest as he stepped back into the corridor, the mansion pressing in around him once more. For a moment, he hesitated. Then, slowly, he glanced back over his shoulder, half expecting the door to still be open, half expecting to find Malric watching him. Lord Malric had been watching him long before that glance. The halls of the mansion were quieter in the mornings, save for the faint echoes of slaves shuffling through their routines. He preferred these moments of near solitude before the feasts, before the politics, before the weight of his position pressed heavily upon him once again. Seated in his private chamber, Malric swirled a goblet of dark red liquid, his pale fingers caressing the rim. The blood was still warm, harvested mere moments ago, but it tasted stale to him. No matter how fresh, how rich, it was never enough. Not because he craved more, but because it no longer satiated him the way it did others of his kind. He cast his gaze toward the large window overlooking the courtyard. A group of slaves, heads bowed, moved like cattle under the watchful eyes of the guards. Somewhere among them was Luke, the human with defiance burning behind his weary eyes. Malric had noticed him more than once, the way his jaw clenched during meals, the subtle glances he exchanged with his companion. Luke hated his kind, and Malric couldn't blame him. "The boy would drive a stake through my heart if he thought he had a chance," Malric mused aloud, his voice a quiet murmur. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. A younger vampire stepped inside, bowing low. "Lord Malric, the arch-vampire requests your presence for tonight's council meeting." "Of course he does," Malric replied, waving the messenger away. The arch-vampire, with his endless schemes and taste for theatrics, ruled the mansion with an iron grip. Malric respected his power but despised his methods. Cruelty to the arch. Vampire was an art form, a means to remind humans and vampires alike of their place in his world. Once the messenger had gone, Malric's eyes fell upon the empty cage in the corner of his chamber. He didn't keep pets. The very idea repulsed him, enslaving a human for personal amusement, treating them as objects. His peers mocked him for it, of course. They called him soft, a traitor to his nature. But Malric had lived long enough to know that vampires were not gods. They were parasites, cursed to exist in the shadows of the world they'd conquered. For every vampire who reveled in bloodlust, there were others like him who saw the futility of it all. Survival, yes. Dominance, no. The slaves are not the only ones in chains, he thought bitterly, draining the goblet. Malric walked the eastern corridor, his boots clicking softly against the stone floors. The east wing was far quieter than the rest of the mansion, its halls lined with heavy, locked doors. These were the chambers of the arch-vampire, a place that even the most powerful avoided unless summoned. The guards stationed along the wing were unlike the others, hulking brutes with eyes as black as tar and expressions carved from stone. These were the arch-vampire's enhancements, former vampires who had willingly subjected themselves to his experiments in pursuit of greater strength and endurance. Malric allowed his gaze to linger on one of them, a towering figure with a jagged scar running down the length of his face. He looked more beast than man, his pale skin stretched taut over muscle that seemed ready to burst through his uniform. Rumors swirled that the enhancements came at a cost, a vampire's sanity. As Malric passed one of the locked doors, he caught a faint metallic sound, like chains dragging across stone. The smell of blood was stronger here, mixed with something acrid and chemical. The arch-vampire was at work again. His experiments, Malric knew, were as much about power as they were control. The arch-vampire had no patience for vampires who overstepped their station or dared to challenge his authority. Those who fell out of favor were brought here, stripped of their arrogance and ambition, and transformed or destroyed in equal measure. Malric paused outside a particularly thick door, its edges sealed with iron. There were no sounds from within, but the cold radiating from the room was enough to chill even his immortal body. "They say he's working on something new," a voice murmured behind him. Malric turned to see a fellow noble, Lord Rafe, standing in the shadows. Rafe was a wiry vampire with sharp features and an unsettling smirk that seemed permanently etched onto his face. "What new horror has he conjured this time?" Malric replied dryly. "Something to ensure our kind never fall," Rafe said, his tone carrying equal parts reverence and fear. "Or so he claims." Malric said nothing. The arch-vampire's obsession with perfection had consumed him for centuries. He sought to mold their kind into something unstoppable, immune to sunlight, hunger, and even the passage of time. But Malric had seen what happened to those who failed the arch-vampire's trials. Their screams still echoed in his mind. As Malric approached the end of the corridor, his sharp hearing caught a faint whimper from one of the nearby doors. He slowed his pace, his eyes narrowing. Inside, a voice was speaking, low and deliberate. He didn't need to press his ear to the door to know who it belonged to. The arch-vampire himself rarely raised his voice, but his words carried the weight of authority. "You dared to challenge my judgment," the arch-vampire was saying, his tone ice-cold. "Do you understand what that means, child?" A muffled response followed, a female voice, trembling with fear. Malric didn't recognize it, but he knew its fate. Those who struck too far above their station, who dared to question the hierarchy, often found themselves in these chambers. Malric continued walking, unwilling to stay and listen. He had no intention of drawing the arch-vampire's attention, especially not now. His distaste for the cruelty of his kind was one thing, but even he was not foolish enough to openly oppose the arch-vampire. As he emerged from the east wing, Malric cast one final glance back at the guarded corridor. The arch-vampire ruled with fear, and his experiments were a testament to that power. But Malric couldn't help but wonder, how long could they cling to control through fear alone? How long before the cracks began to show? The arch-vampire was a force to be reckoned with, yes, but even the strongest forces could crumble under the weight of their own hubris. Later, as he crossed the west wing, Malric paused at a railing overlooking the dining hall. Below, the slaves cleaned and cleared the remnants of the earlier feast. His eyes scanned the room until they landed on Luke, scrubbing the floor with mechanical precision. Malric could see the tension in the boy's shoulders, the quiet fury in the way he gripped the brush. He wondered if Luke even realized how transparent his anger was. Perhaps not. Perhaps he thought himself unreadable, a mere tool obeying orders. Malric smirked faintly. Defiance was a dangerous quality in a slave, but it was also the one he respected most. "Soon," he murmured, his voice lost in the cavernous expanse of the hall. "We'll see how far your courage truly goes." His gaze lingered on Luke a moment longer as the boy scrubbed the stone, tension coiled tight in his shoulders. It was already there. The question, the breaking point. Malric could see it forming long before the boy himself would dare to act on it. The cell was cold, as always, but Luke barely seemed to feel it. The thought had followed him back, unwelcome, persistent, coiling tighter the longer he sat there. He rested against the wall, arms on his knees, while Jake paced in front of him. Their conversation had shifted now from ideally grumbling into something quieter, more dangerous. "We can't just keep doing this," Jake said, his voice low but filled with simmering anger. "Every day, we get weaker. And for what? To keep feeding them?" Luke sighed, his gaze fixed on the faint scratches on the wall marks left by countless slaves before them. "You think I don't know that? But this place? It's a fortress. We make one wrong move and we're dead." Jake stopped pacing, his eyes narrowing. "We're already dead, Luke. Just slower." Before Luke could respond, the sound of boots echoed down the hallway. The guards were coming. The slaves silently prepared themselves for whatever task was to be thrust upon them next. Luke clenched his fists, his mind still lingering on Jake's words. The room reeked of sterile alcohol and something faintly metallic. Blood, Luke realized, his stomach twisting. Slaves filed into the makeshift medical chamber, each stripped to their bare torsos, sweat glistening on their backs from the suffocating heat of the mansion. The guards loomed close, their eyes glinting with sadistic amusement as the slaves hesitated, the needles glinting ominously on the tray before them. Luke stepped forward reluctantly, his gaze flicking toward the corner of the room. There, sitting hunched and shivering on a narrow wooden bench, was the pet. Her green eyes darted nervously to each slave as they approached. She was stripped to her undergarments, her delicate shoulders marked with faint bruises and her hair slightly tangled, as though no one had cared enough to smooth it after the day's ordeals. Luke swallowed hard. She was stunning, even now, even in this place. Her beauty was almost surreal, a cruel reminder of the old world, of times when women like her were seen on television screens and magazines, not dragged through hell. The thin fabric clung to her figure, highlighting every curve. It felt wrong to notice, but he couldn't stop. She wasn't just beautiful. She was a symbol, a road of the humanity they'd lost. The pet caught him staring and flinched. "Next?" The head slave barked, snapping Luke out of his trance. He stepped forward, pulling off his shirt as the needle pierced his arm. The burn was immediate, sharp, and all too familiar. When it was the pet's turn, she hesitated. A guard smirked, his fingers twitching toward the whip at his belt. The head slave hissed under his breath, "Don't make a scene." Luke watched as the green-eyed pet moved to the center of the room, her hands trembling. The needle pressed into her arm, and a small sound escaped her lips. He felt something tighten in his chest. When she was done, she stumbled back to the bench, her hand clutching the sore spot on her arm. As the guards turned their attention away, she whispered, her voice a ghostly rasp. "Help me." Luke froze. He knew he should ignore her, should walk away like everyone else, but those eyes green as summer fields were impossible to look away from. "I can't," he whispered back, barely audible. Her lip quivered, but she nodded, resignation dulling the spark of hope in her gaze. As he turned to leave, her voice reached him again, quieter this time. "I'll die here. We all will."